The blood was still wet on the council hall floor when Seraphine Voss carried the medicine tray through the door. She did not announce herself. She never did. 3 years of working as Marin's assistant had taught her that the quieter she moved, the longer she could stay, and the more she could learn. She pressed close to the wall and set the tray on the edge of the nearest bench, her eyes moving across the room with the quick, careful attention of someone who had learned to read a situation before speaking into it. The council was in a state she had never seen before. Not angry, exactly. Something worse than angry. The men who stood around the long stone table looked like people who had just been told that the ground under their feet was hollow. Councillor Aldrich stood at the head of the table. He was a wide man, with a thick gray beard, and the kind of voice that usually filled rooms without effort. But tonight, his voice was stripped down to something quiet and awful. 3 more settlements reported contact with the wraiths at dawn, he said. They are moving faster than the last projection. The eastern grove is gone. General Gareth, the man with the deep scar running from his left ear to his chin, stood with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the table. He was not a man who showed distress easily, but his jaw was tight enough that Seraphine could see the muscle working under the skin. The fang blade is in 7 pieces, Gareth said. We have no weapon capable of stopping the wraiths at the front line. Our fighters are holding them back with fire and movement barriers, but that is a delay, not a solution. Everyone in this room knows that. How long can the delay hold? Asked a younger man near the back, a junior council member named Cole whose voice still cracked slightly when he was frightened. Gareth looked at him. 1 lunar cycle, perhaps less. The room absorbed that in silence. Seraphine stayed still and let them forget she was there. She had been present when Rowan died. She had been in the field station 2 days ago when they brought him in. The fang blade shattered in his grip, 7 pieces of dark metal scattered around him like broken teeth. She had helped Marin clean the wounds on his hands where the broken edges had cut him. He had been alive long enough to ask about his daughter, and then he had not been alive anymore. His daughter's name was Ivy. She was 3 years old. She had her father's nose and a laugh that carried halfway across the eastern courtyard when something pleased her. Seraphine picked up the medicine tray and moved toward the injured captain sitting in the far corner. He was a broad man named Bram who had taken a deep cold wound on his left side during the same battle that had taken Rowan. Marin had treated it twice already, but the cold that hollow wraiths left behind in their wake did not respond to ordinary medicine. It needed the kind of warmth that only a blade with real power could counteract. She was halfway back across the room when Aldrich's voice stopped her. Marin's message says the blade can be reforged, he said. She stopped walking. She did not turn around, but she stopped. She sent written instructions this morning, Aldrich continued, unfolding a paper with large, careful hands. He read slowly, as though the words were not quite sitting right on the page. The fang blade requires a binding element to be reforged, not metal, not fire. An essence, drawn from the marrow of a willing donor, someone who gives it without pressure and without condition. Silence. Marrow, Gareth said flatly. From the spine, Aldrich said. The silence that followed had weight to it. Seraphine could feel it pressing against the room from all sides. She is asking someone to submit to a spinal drawing, one of the men said quietly, as though he hoped no one would confirm it. Voluntarily, Aldrich repeated. The essence only works if it is given freely. Marin is clear about that. And the cost to the person who gives it? Aldrich folded the paper with great care. She describes it as significant pain, uncertain recovery, possible permanent changes to the donor's wolf energy. The room waited. No one spoke. Not the general with the battle scar, not the junior council member, not the 3 senior warriors standing along the east wall who had faced hollow wraiths in open ground and come back from it. Not one of them offered a word. Seraphine looked at the floor. She looked at the boots of the men around the table. She looked at the blood that had not been cleaned up yet, dried now into a dark, irregular line along the edge of the stone where someone had tracked it coming in. She set the medicine tray down on the bench and walked out. She went down the 2 flights of stairs that led to the forge room below the main building, through the narrow corridor that always smelled of iron, and something older and deeper than iron, and she pushed open the door without knocking. Marin was already there. She stood at the center table, with her back to the door, her gray hair pinned up in the way it always was when she was working, her hands moving over the blade fragments with the slow deliberation of someone who already knew what had to happen, and was only waiting for the world to catch up with her. You heard, she said, without turning. The council is not going to find a volunteer, Seraphine said. No, Marin agreed. Tell me what it actually involves. All of it. Not the version from the paper. Marin turned. She looked at Seraphine for a long moment, reading her face the way she always did, not searching for weakness but for understanding. Then she pulled 2 chairs close to the work table and sat down. Seraphine sat across from her. Marin folded her hands together and spoke plainly. In wolfkind, she said, the spine was not simply a structure of bone. It was the channel through which a person's inner energy moved. Everything a person had ever done, every moment of courage or grief or quiet endurance, left traces in the marrow. Those traces accumulated over a lifetime. They were not visible to the eye, but they were real, and they were as specific to each person as fingerprints. The original fang blade had been forged 200 years ago by a healer whose name was found only in the oldest of the archive texts. He had used the marrow essence of a warrior who volunteered to give it. That warrior's essence had bound the blade together at a level deeper than metal, deeper than any physical structure. It was why the blade had never been merely a weapon. It had been a living thing, in its own way. And now it was broken. To reforge it, Marin would need to draw that same kind of essence from a living donor. 7 points along the spine, each one reached with a bone needle designed specifically for the purpose. The essence drawn at each point would be transferred directly to the corresponding blade fragment. The process would take several hours. The pain would be severe at every point. The donor's energy channels would be disrupted during the drawing, and for a significant time afterward. How significant a time? Seraphine asked. Months, Marin said. She held Seraphine's eyes without flinching. Possibly permanently. I cannot tell you otherwise, and remain honest with you. Seraphine looked at the blade pieces laid out on the forge table. 7 fragments of dark metal, cold and absolutely still. They had been arranged in the correct order, largest to smallest, like a spine itself, laid out for examination. She thought about Rowan. She thought about Ivy, who was 3, and did not yet understand the word permanently in any of its meanings. She thought about the 4 settlements that were ash now. She thought about the ones behind them, still standing but not for much longer, the families inside them who did not know how little time remained between what they had now and what would be left of it. She thought about herself, 23 years old. No bonded mate, no rank worth speaking of, no name that anyone would say in a council hall for any reason except to send her on an errand. She had been in Ironmore for 3 years, and she could count on one hand the number of times anyone above her in the pack structure had asked her opinion on anything. I'll do it, she said. Marin's expression stayed steady, but something shifted behind her eyes. Seraphine. You know none of them are going to volunteer, Seraphine said. She was not bitter about it. She was simply clear about it. The warriors have bonded mates. They have rank. They have things that depend on them being whole. I don't have any of that. You matter, Marin said firmly. The absence of a bond does not make you less than them. Then let me choose what I matter for, Seraphine said. Marin was quiet for a long time. Outside the forge room, somewhere above them, Seraphine could hear the distant murmur of the council hall, the low voices of men still searching for a solution they would not find among themselves tonight. Finally, Marin stood. She moved to the shelf along the wall and began pulling down glass jars and bound tools and things wrapped in dark cloth, setting them on the table in a careful, deliberate order. The blood moon is in 3 nights, she said quietly. The energy current runs strongest under it. The binding will be more stable. 3 nights, Seraphine said. You will rest until then. Eat well, sleep the full hours. Do not carry anything heavy. Marin turned to look at her over one shoulder. And Seraphine, if at any point during the process you need it to stop, you tell me immediately. There is no obligation that continues past your word. It won't need to stop, Seraphine said. She did not say this with any particular force. She said it the same quiet way she said everything, because it was simply true. And she knew herself well enough to know that she did not make decisions and then unmake them. She had never had the luxury of that kind of doubt, and the habit of certainty had become something she trusted. She stood up, nodded once at Marin, and walked back upstairs. She went through the hall and out into the Ironmore evening. The sky was low and gray, the kind of sky that holds its color long past sunset. A group of children played near the eastern fence, chasing each other between the posts with the pure, total freedom of people who don't yet understand what is coming toward them. Their laughter carried clean and bright through the heavy air. Seraphine watched them for a while. Then she walked to the small room she shared with two other low-ranked pack members, who were both out. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hands. They were steady. She was glad about that. Steady hands were something she had learned to value, in the forge room and in field stations, and in the middle of the night when Marin needed help and there was no one else. She had spent a great deal of her life being the person who carried things, medicine trays and water buckets and other people's grief. She was good at it. She had developed, over time, the kind of strength that does not announce itself, the kind that is simply present when it is needed, constant and unremarked. Nobody had ever asked her what she wanted. Nobody had ever seemed to think there was a question worth asking. But this, she thought, this choice, made in a small forge room with no audience and no ceremony, and no one recording it, this was hers. She breathed in, and she breathed out, and she let the evening settle around her. 3 nights. She could manage 3 nights. She could not have known then, sitting on the edge of that narrow bed in that small gray room, that the decision she had just made in the forge room below would travel farther than the blade itself. That the essence she would give would carry something into the metal that the old texts had no complete name for. That a cold and grieving king in a distant palace would touch that blade for the first time and stand very still for a very long time, his hand on the hilt, feeling something he had spent 7 years making absolutely certain he would never feel again. She only knew what she had decided. She lay down, closed her eyes, and listened to the Ironmore night settle around the buildings. Above her, through the stone walls and the heavy gray sky, the moon was 3 nights away from full red. In the north, quietly, the hollow wraiths moved through the trees. The night of the blood moon came in without wind. That was the first thing Seraphine noticed when she stepped outside at midnight. The air was perfectly still, and the sky above Ironmore was a deep, clear red, the moon hanging full and low as though it had descended on purpose. In the old stories, blood moons were markers, points on the timeline of the world where the ordinary rules bent just slightly, where the space between what was natural and what was possible became thinner than usual. Marin had explained that 2 evenings ago, sitting at the forge table with a cooling cup of tea between her palms. She had explained it the way she explained most things, carefully and without romanticism. But Seraphine had heard the weight underneath the words. This was not an ordinary night. What was done in the forge room tonight would be done at the absolute peak of the energy current, and the binding it produced would last as long as the blade itself. If it worked. Seraphine walked down the 2 flights of stairs without a lamp. She knew every step of the route by now. Her fingers found the wall in the dark, and she moved through the corridor by memory, her footsteps quiet on the stone floor. She had been down here hundreds of times over 3 years, carrying things, cleaning things, learning the work that Marin did, and that most of the pack above them gave no thought to. She had always found the forge room quieter than the rest of the building, quieter in a way that felt intentional, as though the work that happened inside it required a particular kind of silence to hold its shape. The door was open tonight. Light came through it, lamplight, warmer than usual. She could hear Marin inside, the soft, purposeful sounds of preparation. She stepped through the door. Marin had changed the room. The long work table had been cleared of everything except its covering cloth, dark and smooth. On either side of it, 7 oil lamps burned in a row, each at a slightly different height, casting warm, overlapping circles of light that moved gently along the ceiling. The blade fragments had been set in a framework at the head of the table, arranged in their correct order, held upright by thin iron supports, so that they faced down the length of the space like a row of waiting things. Marin stood at the preparation table assembling her instruments. She wore her long work apron, and her hair was freshly pinned. When she looked up and saw Seraphine in the doorway, she held the look for a moment, and then she nodded once. "Come in," she said. Seraphine came in. She saw the other people in the room then. 3 figures stood along the far wall. Aldrich the counselor, Gareth, still in his day clothes as though he had not slept, and a smaller, quieter man named Finn, who was one of the lower-ranking healers, but who had studied under Marin for a decade. and was known throughout the pack for having the steadiest hands of anyone in any room. "They are here to witness," Marin said. "They will not interfere." Seraphine looked at the three men along the wall. Aldrich appeared deeply uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable that a man looks when he knows he should have been the one making the offer that someone else is making for him. Gareth was working very hard to look like nothing in the room affected him. Finn just looked at her with the direct, honest face of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen, and had too much respect for it to pretend otherwise. She met Finn's eyes and gave him a small nod. He nodded back. "Is there anything you need before we begin?" Marin asked. "No," Seraphine said. "You understand that you may stop this process at any point?" "Yes." "And you are choosing this freely?" "Yes," Seraphine said. "I am." Marin gestured to the table. Seraphine removed her outer layer and lay face down on the cloth, her arms at her sides, her forehead resting on the folded pad Marin had placed at the near end. She could see the floor below through the small gap between her face and the table edge. The stone was very clean. The room was warm from the lamps, but she felt cold for a moment, the way the body sometimes feels cold, right before something important begins, not from temperature but from awareness. She breathed through it. "The first point is at the base of the neck," Marin said. She was standing at Seraphine's right side, her voice low and even. "I will tell you before each one. There will be a moment of pressure before the sensation deepens. Breathe through it, and keep breathing." "I will," Seraphine said. "The process will take several hours." "I know." A pause, then Marin said, "Begin." The first needle went in, at the base of Seraphine's neck. She had prepared herself thoroughly in 3 nights of thinking about this. She had told herself, carefully and honestly, that she understood what pain was, and that she could manage it, that she had moved through difficult things before, and this was simply more of the same, applied more directly. She had been wrong about that. This was not like any other pain she had experienced. It was deep and specific, and it moved through her in a wave that started at the needle point and radiated both outward and inward at the same time, as though something that had been sealed her entire life was being opened for the first time. It was not the sharp, blunt pain of injury. It was an opening pain, which was somehow harder to prepare for, because it did not stop. It settled. It stayed. She breathed. She did not scream. She did not grip the table. Her hands lay still at her sides because she had decided they would, and she breathed the way Marin had taught her to breathe when treating a wound that required steadiness, slow in and slow out, counting 4 each way, keeping the rhythm deliberate and unbroken. She heard Aldrich make a very quiet sound against the wall. She heard Gareth shift his weight on the stone floor. She kept her eyes open and looked at the clean stone below the table. Marin worked with extraordinary care. Between each point, she paused long enough for the worst of the sensation to recede to a manageable level. She spoke quietly throughout, describing each step before it happened, keeping Seraphine inside the process rather than simply enduring it from outside. "Second point," Marin said, after several minutes. "Just below the first. Breathe." The second was worse. Seraphine breathed through it. By the third, she could see something beginning to change at the edges of her vision. The lamplight in the room was shifting. It was not growing brighter exactly, but its color was changing, taking on a faint violet tinge at the margins, the way firelight sometimes catches something in the air and throws an unexpected hue across a surface. She blinked. "The essence is moving," Marin said quietly, and there was something underneath her voice that Seraphine had never heard there before, something that might have been wonder. "Keep breathing." Seraphine breathed. The 4th and 5th points were in the center of her back, and by the time Marin completed the 5th, Seraphine had lost her usual sense of the time passing. She was not unconscious. She was entirely present, but the world had narrowed to the immediate experience of her own body, and the sound of Marin's steady voice guiding her through it. She was not thinking about the council above them, or the hollow wraiths at the border, or even about Ivy. She was simply here, simply breathing, simply giving what she had agreed to give. Then she heard a sound she had not expected. It came from the head of the table, from where the blade fragments stood in their iron framework. A low, clear sound, barely above silence, the kind of sound a crystal glass makes when someone passes a wet finger carefully around its rim. A single sustained note, thin and true. She heard Aldrich draw a sharp breath against the wall. "It's responding," Finn said. He said it barely above a whisper. Marin said nothing. She was already moving to the 6th point. By the time the 7th needle touched the base of Seraphine's spine, the room had completely changed. The lamplight was fully violet now, a deep living color that moved along the walls the way light moves at the bottom of clear water, and the blade fragments at the head of the table were luminous. They glowed with the same silver-violet light, each piece separately at first, bright and distinct. And then as Marin completed the final drawing and lifted the last needle with hands that were absolutely, completely steady, the light between the pieces reached outward, like fingers finding each other across a small distance. Seraphine heard the sound again, deeper now, not a thin note, a pulse, a heartbeat. She closed her eyes. She did not lose consciousness right away. She lay on the table in the violet lamplight and felt the last of the drawn energy leave her, felt the space it left behind. Not empty exactly, but open. Hollow in the way a new wound is hollow, clean and raw, and waiting for something to fill it eventually. She heard Marin say something to Finn. She could not make out the words through the sound of her own blood in her ears. She heard movement. She heard Aldrich's voice, low and strange, as if he were describing something impossible to someone standing just outside the door. She heard the heartbeat in the metal slow and deepen and settle. Then she did not hear anything. When she came back to herself, it was much later. She was on her side on the table with a blanket covering her, and Finn was holding a cup near her face, the warm steam from an herb mixture rising against her cheek. The lamps had been lowered. The room was quieter and smaller in the way rooms feel when the most significant thing has already happened inside them. She turned her head slowly. The blade fragments were still in their framework at the head of the table, but they had changed. They were no longer entirely separate. Where before there had been clear visible gaps between each of the 7 pieces, now those gaps had narrowed to the thinnest of lines. The silver-violet light along the edges of each piece was faint now, like embers rather than flame, but it was there, steady. "It's working," she said. Her voice came out rougher than expected. "Don't speak yet," Finn said, and moved the cup closer. She drank. It was a strong herb preparation that Marin used after difficult procedures, bitter and warming in the chest. Marin came to stand beside her. The old healer looked tired in a way that ran bone deep, but her eyes were sharp, and her hands, when she checked Seraphine's pulse at the wrist, were completely steady. "The first stage is complete," Marin said. "The binding has initiated. The blade will finish drawing itself together over the next 2 days. The energy you gave is holding. The link has established." Seraphine looked at the nearly sealed blade pieces and felt something she had not anticipated. Not pride. Something quieter than pride. The specific satisfaction of a thing done properly and thoroughly. The feeling she got when she helped Marin close a wound cleanly, and the tissue held. "How is your back?" Finn asked. "Consistent with having 7 needles placed in it," she said. He almost smiled. "Yes, that tracks accurately." Aldrich stepped forward from his place along the wall. The man who had stood before a room of warriors earlier that night, and watched none of them step forward, was looking at Seraphine now, with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that had been rearranged behind his eyes in the last several hours. "Seraphine," he said. He said her name with deliberate care, as though making sure he had it right. "Will the blade be ready in 2 days?" she asked. He stopped. "Marin believes so, yes," he said. "Then that's what matters," she said. She did not say this unkindly. She said it because it was true. She had not done this for a speech, or a grateful look from a man who had not volunteered himself. She had done it because it needed doing, and because she had decided to do it. She closed her eyes, and let the warmth of the blanket settle, and let Finn's quiet movements in the room be the only sounds for a while. The blade at the head of the table pulsed once, soft and slow, like something settling into rest. Outside the forge room, far above them, Ironmore slept under the fading red of the blood moon. In the north, the hollow wraiths moved through the dark, as they had been moving for months, slow and steady, and absolutely certain of their direction. But tonight, in this room carved into the hillside below the main pack buildings, something had been made. Something that had a heartbeat. And it beat on through the rest of the night, while Seraphine slept, and the lamps burned low, and Marin sat at her preparation table and waited, the way she had been waiting since the first time she had read the old texts, and understood what they were saying. The blade came together on the third day at sunset. Seraphine was not in the forge room when it happened. She was on a low cot that Marin had set up in the adjacent room, close enough to be checked regularly, far enough from the blade fragments that the energy current between them would not interfere with her body's recovery. Finn came in at 6 in the evening with a bowl of soup and the news that the last 2 pieces had sealed together, and the sealing had happened not with a crack or a flash, but with a sound like breath, a single quiet exhale, as though the blade had been holding itself in pieces for 2 centuries and had finally been allowed to become whole again. She sat up slowly. Her back hurt in the deep, settled way it had hurt since the ritual, not sharp now, just present. A constant awareness in the tissue that something had been taken and would not be replaced in the ordinary way. "Can I see it?" she asked. Finn looked at her with the patient expression he used for all decisions that required a person to be honest with themselves. "When you can walk to it without holding the wall," he said. She took that as a fair condition. She spent the next hour moving carefully around the recovery room, pacing the edges of it, until the motion was smooth enough that she felt she had met the standard. Then she walked to the forge room door and opened it. The room was more crowded than she expected. Marin was there, standing at the far end of the table, and Aldrich, and Gareth, and 3 other men she recognized from the council's outer circle who had not been present at the ritual, and who now stood along the wall, in the particular stillness of people who are trying very hard to appear unaffected by what they are looking at. The fang blade lay on the forge table. It was whole. She had never seen the original before it shattered. She had only ever seen the 7 cold, dull pieces of it, scattered and silent, carrying Rowan's blood on their edges. But the thing on the table was neither cold nor silent. It was dark metal, with a blade edge that caught the lamplight and threw it back in colors that did not quite match what had gone in, silver and violet, and a thread of deep gold running along the center line of the flat. And it was humming. Not loudly, not with any drama. It was the kind of sound that you felt in your chest before your ears processed it as sound at all, a vibration just below the threshold of ordinary hearing, steady and constant and undeniably alive. Seraphine walked to the table. She did not reach out to touch the blade. She stood beside it and looked at it and breathed. It responded. She was not imagining it. The hum shifted slightly when she came near it, the way a flame leans toward a breeze, not away from her but toward her. The silver-violet light along the edges brightened by a fraction, so small that someone watching from across the room might not have caught it. But real. "It knows you," Marin said quietly from the other side of the table. "Is that normal?" Seraphine asked. "It is documented in the older texts," Marin said. "When the essence link is strong, the blade can maintain a residual awareness of the donor. It is rare, but it is documented." "What does that mean practically?" Marin was quiet for a moment, selecting her words carefully, the way she selected everything. "It means that wherever this blade travels, a part of what you gave will travel with it. The binding does not end when the process ends. It is permanent, the way a healed scar is permanent. The blade is connected to you now, not yours to own, but yours to be connected to, for as long as it exists." Seraphine looked at the blade for a moment longer. She looked then at Gareth, who was the most direct man in Ironmore's leadership, and the most likely to have the information she actually needed, without decoration around it. "When does it leave?" she asked him. He held her eyes steadily. "Tomorrow morning. A courier from the Alpha King's palace arrived this morning. Ashvale sent a formal inquiry last week about the blade's status. Aldrich responded, and confirmed the reforging was underway." He paused a beat. "The Alpha King's court has requested that the completed blade be delivered to Ashvale Palace as a formal gesture of Ironmore's military loyalty and alliance. We have agreed to the request." "So, you are sending it to King Cadron Ashvale," she said. "Yes." She looked at the blade again. Something about the fact of its departure felt unfinished, though she could not fully name the shape of it. She was not a council member. The blade was not hers to keep or direct. "Does he know how it was made?" she asked. "Not just that it was reforged, the specifics." "The accompanying document summarizes the binding method," Aldrich said. She noted the word summarizes and let it sit for a moment without pursuing it. At dawn the next morning, before most of the pack was awake, she stood in the courtyard and watched the armored carriage move out through the Ironmore gates. The blade was in a sealed iron case inside it, wrapped in cloth that Marin had chosen, and secured with clasps that Finn had tightened. 3 mounted guards rode alongside, their breath visible in the cold morning air. The gates closed behind the carriage. Seraphine stood in the courtyard and watched the road where it had been. The hum she had been aware of since the 3rd day of the reforging, low and constant, a vibration she had assumed was purely internal and residual from the ritual, faded as the carriage moved away. Not all at once, gradually, the way sound fades when its source travels into distance. By the time the carriage had gone beyond sight around the first bend in the road, the hum was gone. She had not expected to notice its absence as clearly as she did. She noticed it very clearly. She stood in the courtyard a moment longer, and then went back inside. Marin was making tea when she returned. She said nothing about the carriage or the blade. She handed Seraphine a cup, and they sat together at the small table in the room off the forge, and drank in the comfortable quiet that existed between people who have been through something large together. After a while, Marin said, "How is your back this morning?" "Improving," Seraphine said. "Better than yesterday. The energy channels are settling. You'll have better days and harder days for a while still. Don't lift anything significant." "I won't." Marin held her cup in both hands and looked at the table for a moment. Outside, the early morning sky was beginning to lighten at the farthest edge, pale and cold. "Seraphine, there are things I should have told you before the ritual that I didn't tell you, because I was not certain they were relevant, and I did not want to add weight to what you were already carrying. I should have told you anyway." Seraphine set down her cup. "Tell me now." Marin looked up and met her eyes. "The essence link I described, the permanent connection between you and the blade, carries implications I only partially disclosed to you. In most historical cases of this kind of forging, the donor and the blade exist in close proximity for the remainder of the donor's life. The blade stays within the same pack or in the care of someone known to the donor. The link remains quiet, unremarkable. Both people simply continue their lives. "But," Seraphine said, "but in the documented cases where the blade passes to someone who is unmated," Marin said carefully, "someone whose own energy channels are open and seeking, the essence link can develop differently than the quiet version. The connection can reach the carrier through the blade and create a pathway between the carrier and the donor that is more significant than a residual trace." Seraphine looked at her. "How much more significant?" "I don't know the full extent of it yet," Marin said. "I am watching for signs of its development. I wanted you to know about the possibility, in case you experience something unexpected, a sense of direction, a feeling of being pulled towards something at a distance." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "The Alpha King," she said. "Cadron Ashvale. Is he mated?" "No," Marin said. "His bonded mate died 7 years ago. He has not taken another." Seraphine looked at the table. She sat with this information for a while, turning it over, examining it the way she examined the contents of a medicine jar before using it, checking for what was actually inside. Somewhere to the north and east, through several mountain passes and across 2 territorial borders, an armored carriage moved through the early morning light, on a road that led to Ashvale Palace. And inside that carriage, in a sealed iron case, a blade that had been broken and was now whole, hummed at a frequency only Seraphine Voss could feel the absence of. She finished her tea. "Is there anything I should do?" she asked. Marin was quiet for a long moment. "Be patient," she said, "and pay attention to what you feel." Seraphine nodded. She picked up her cup and carried it to the basin, and washed it, and set it on the rack the way she did every morning. Outside, Ironmore was waking up. She could hear the sounds of it through the stone walls, the ordinary sounds of a pack going about its day, children's voices, someone moving wood, the distant sound of a training exercise starting up near the western fence. She stood in Marin's kitchen and listened to the morning. The blade was gone. It was on its way to a king she had never met, in a palace she had never seen, at the center of a political world that she had no standing in, and no reason to think she would ever enter. She had given what she had given. It was gone. She went back to the recovery room and lay down and looked at the ceiling, and breathed and waited for the better days Marin had promised. The great hall of Ashvale Palace was cold in the way that large stone-floored rooms are always cold in winter, even when the central fire is enormous and well-tended. The warmth from the hearth reached the nearest walls comfortably, and became purely theoretical by the time it reached the far end of the room. Cadron Ashvale stood at the head of the hall, and noticed neither the cold nor the warmth. He had stopped noticing temperature somewhere in the last several years. He had stopped noticing a great many things that most people found significant, which was something his court had quietly learned to work around, the way people learn to walk around a piece of furniture that has been moved to a slightly inconvenient position and cannot be moved back. He was 31 years old. He had ruled the 12 territories for 7 years. He was built like a man who had been trained from earliest childhood for the specific purpose of being difficult to move, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that was not unhandsome, but that arranged itself, by default, into an expression that communicated to most people that beauty was beside the point. His eyes were dark gray. They had been described in court poetry that he had never read as the color of the sky before a storm that does not arrive. He was listening to his general's morning report without appearing to be listening. This was not an act of deception. It was simply that he had attended enough morning reports over 7 years that his mind could process them as background information, while the rest of him waited to be required for something. The eastern border remained stable overnight, Owen was saying. Owen was his head of intelligence, a compact and perpetually quiet man with sharp eyes, and a voice that carried farther than seemed reasonable for its volume. 3 reports of hollow wraith movement in the outer territories, all contained by local pack measures. The border packs are managing, but several have flagged that their current containment approach is not sustainable indefinitely. With what resources are they managing? Cadron said. Owen glanced up from his notes. Fire lines and movement barriers primarily. Fire lines and movement barriers are delays, Cadron said. He said it the way he said most things, without heat, which somehow made it sharper than if he had raised his voice. How many of the 12 packs have confirmed they cannot hold their current containment strategy past 1 lunar cycle? Owen paused with the precision of someone whose pauses are accurate rather than careless. 8, he said. The room held that number in silence for a moment. Clara, who was Cadron's longest-serving advisor and the only person in the entire palace who spoke to him as though he were still a person rather than a governing structure, cleared her throat from her place at the side table. She was a sharp-faced woman in her early 50s who had served his family since before his birth, and who expressed care, when she expressed it at all, by being extremely practical about immediate problems. The Ironmore courier arrived an hour ago, she said. The fang blade has been completed. The room changed. Even the men standing along the walls straightened slightly, the particular adjustment that happens in a room when something that has been desperately hoped for is mentioned for the first time as real. Cadron turned to look at her. It's here? He said. In the outer courtyard, in a sealed case. The Ironmore Alpha sends it as a formal gesture of military alliance, along with a letter. Bring it, he said. Clara brought the sealed iron case herself and set it on the long table. Owen stood to one side. The rest of the room found a way to stay present without appearing to be crowding. Cadron looked at the case. It was iron, about the length of a man's forearm, sealed with 3 clasps. There was a smell to it that he could not immediately identify, something between forge smoke and cold water, and something else entirely, something he had no existing frame of reference for. He noted this without trying to solve it. He reached forward and opened the 3 clasps one by one. He lifted the lid. The fang blade lay in dark cloth. It was unmistakably and completely the blade that the historical records described. The same proportions, the same dark metal, the same design at the guard and grip that matched the illustrations in the archived texts he had studied after learning of its shattering. But the records had not prepared him for what it actually was to be in the same room with it, now that it was whole. It was present, in the way that living things are present and objects are not. It did not move. It made no sound he could hear with his ears. But it occupied the space it was in, the way a person occupies space, with awareness, with something that was not passive. He reached into the case. His hand closed around the hilt. Something happened. He did not move. He did not speak. He stood with his hand around the grip of the fang blade and held absolutely still while the room waited around him, and he felt, for the first time in 7 years, warmth. Not the warmth of a fire, not a change in temperature. Something older and more specific than either of those, something that traveled directly past the skin and past the chest wall and settled in the center of his body with the quiet authority of something that has arrived exactly where it belongs. No images accompanied it, no voice spoke, but he felt, carried in the metal the way meaning is carried in a letter, even when the letter contains no literal words, the shape of someone's character, the specific and unmistakable texture of a particular kind of courage, not the loud kind that announces itself before a crowd, the other kind. The kind that gets up every morning in a small room and does what needs to be done without needing any witness to confirm its value. He felt loneliness that had existed so long and so completely that it had passed through hurting and become simply a condition of the person carrying it. He felt steadiness. He felt the clean, deep resolve of someone who had made a very significant choice under real pressure and had not looked away from any part of it. He stood there for a length of time that he could not afterwards account for accurately. Then he set the blade carefully back into its case. He turned to Owen. "Find me the person who made this," he said. His voice was the same as it always was, level and controlled. But Owen, who had worked directly for him for 6 years and had developed the ability to read the very narrow register of difference in a man who showed almost none, looked at him with a small but precise shift of attention. "The letter from Ironmore identifies the forge healer as a woman named Marin," Owen said carefully. "She appears to be the primary practitioner responsible for the reforging." "The letter also describes the process requiring a donor," Kadrin said. "The forge skill is Marin's. The binding is the donor's. The thing I felt in this blade came from the donor. Find me the donor." Owen said, "Yes, sir," and walked to the door. Clara said nothing. But when Kadrin turned toward the corridor that led to his private study, she was watching him with an expression that she rearranged into neutrality a fraction of a second after he looked at her, and he caught the trailing edge of it. Something that he might have named, if it had been on any other face, as careful and tentative hope. He did not examine it further. He walked to his study and closed the door and sat at his desk. He did not look at the papers covering every surface of it. He placed his hands flat on the wood and looked at nothing in particular. The blade was in the hall. He could not hear it or feel it from this distance, but the warmth it had placed in his chest had not dissipated. It sat there, small and stubborn, like a single coal in cold ash that should have gone out long before, and hadn't. He sat with it. He thought about what he had felt in the metal. He tried to build a picture from the impression, the way you might try to describe the contents of a room from what you could hear through the closed door. Steady, quiet, strong, in a way that was entirely internal, that required no outside confirmation. Someone who had no expectation of being seen. Someone who had given something very large without anyone instructing them to do it. He had been surrounded for 7 years by people who did everything, for reasons that he could see clearly. Alliance, rank, ambition, carefully maintained loyalty to a structure that protected them. He had become so accustomed to the architecture of motivated behavior that he had genuinely forgotten what it felt like to encounter something done simply because the person doing it had decided it was right, and that was sufficient reason. He thought about this for a long time. He stood up and walked back to the hall. The case was on the table where Clara had left it. He stood over it and looked at the blade lying in the dark cloth. He put his hand in the case and touched the grip again, briefly. The warmth was immediate. Same depth, same quality, same specific texture. Courage pressed into metal. Loneliness worn so smooth and long that it had become simply the shape of a person's ordinary experience. Owen appeared in the doorway. "Sir, we have a name." Kadrin lifted his hand from the blade. "Tell me," he said. "Seraphine Voss, 23 years old, Omega rank. She is the healer's assistant to the woman named Marin at Ironmore Pack." He let the name settle. Seraphine Voss. "Draft a summons," he said. "Official, with my seal. She is to come to Ashvale Palace at the earliest opportunity her pack can arrange." Owen's expression remained perfectly neutral, which was one of its standard states. "And the reason to be given in the summons?" "Blade bond consultation," Kadrin said. "The blade's essence link requires assessment by the person connected to it. That is accurate." "Yes, sir," Owen said, and withdrew. Kadrin stood alone in the hall with the fang blade and the warmth in his chest. Clara appeared in the doorway where Owen had been. She looked at him standing over the open case, and after a moment she said, When is the last time something surprised you? He considered the question with genuine attention, which was how he considered most questions. Some time ago, he said. Good, she said. She was smiling slightly as she walked away. He noted it, and for the first time in a considerable while, he did not find a reason to identify it as a professional liability. He looked at the blade. It hummed, very softly, to no one in the empty hall. The summons arrived at Ironmore on a Wednesday morning in the second week of Seraphine's recovery, delivered by a royal courier on a gray horse, carrying the black wax seal of Ashvale Palace on the envelope. She was in the courtyard when the rider came through the gates, sitting on the bench near the east wall, where the morning sun reached best in winter. She was eating her breakfast with the deliberate pace that Marin had prescribed, and reading from a small book she had borrowed from the forge-room shelf. The courier went directly to the Alpha's residence without stopping or looking around. She watched him go and returned her attention to the book. 20 minutes later, one of the Alpha's attendants came to find her. The Alpha's name was Dara, and she was a compact woman with a closely cropped head of dark hair and the brisk manner of someone who had been in a position of responsibility long enough that she had stopped needing to project authority and now simply carried it as a matter of fact. She regarded Seraphine with the kind of distant practical appreciation that senior figures extend to people who are useful and don't require management. She sat across from Seraphine in the small receiving room off the main hall and placed the opened envelope on the table between them without ceremony. A royal summons, she said. From King Cadron Ashvale, for you specifically. Seraphine picked up the letter and read it. The language was precise and formal and entirely direct. The Alpha King's court requested the presence of Seraphine Voss of Ironmore Pack at Ashvale Palace for the purpose of blade bond consultation related to the recently delivered fang blade. Travel arrangements would be provided by the palace. Her attendance was expected within 5 days of the letter's receipt. She set the letter down on the table. Do I have a choice? She asked. It is a royal summons, Dara said. That's not an answer to my question. Dara looked at her with the fractional shift of expression that occurs when someone unexpectedly says something more direct than expected. You have the theoretical choice to decline the summons, she said. With significant political consequences for the Pack's relationship with the Alpha King. So no, Seraphine said. Practically speaking, no, Dara confirmed. Seraphine nodded and picked up her bread. 5 days is enough time for me to be travel-ready, without Marin needing to come along. Dara looked at her for a moment, as though waiting for the next part of the response. The question about why the Alpha King wanted her specifically. The anxiety about standing before the most powerful wolf in the 12 territories. The request for guidance on how to dress, or what to say, or how to behave in a palace. None of it came. That's all? Dara said. What else is there? Seraphine said. Dara took the letter and left the room with the expression of someone who is not entirely certain how to categorize what just happened. Marin, when informed, went quiet in the particular focused way she went quiet when she was thinking through implications that she had not finished working out. She said she would prepare a travel kit. She said Seraphine's spine was healing on schedule, and travel would not set it back provided she was careful. She said she would write up medical guidance for the journey. She did not say anything about the Alpha King or the Essence Link, or what she suspected might be developing at a distance. Seraphine spent 4 of the 5 days building her strength back, with the methodical attention she gave to every recovery she had assisted with. She walked the courtyard circuit in the mornings, ate everything Marin placed in front of her, slept the full hours she was told to sleep. By the 4th day she could walk the full circuit 3 times without slowing. By the 5th, she could carry a reasonable load without noticeable discomfort. She packed 1 bag. She left her medicine kit with Finn, because she would not need it where she was going, and he would need it here. The carriage the palace sent for her was not what she had expected. She had anticipated something functional, a standard enclosed carriage, suitable for territorial travel. What appeared at the Ironmore gates was upholstered in dark blue interior fabric, pulled by 4 matched horses, with a guard escort of 3 mounted riders in the Alpha King's colors. The pack gathered in the courtyard to watch her go, which was the most collective attention anyone in Ironmore had paid to her in 3 years, possibly more. She got in the carriage and kept her eyes forward. The journey took 4 days. The landscape changed significantly as they traveled south and east. the dark forests and rocky terrain of Ironmoor giving way to open lowland country, where the sky was wider and the light fell differently. The towns they passed through grew larger and more varied with each day. She had not left Ironmoor since her arrival there 3 years ago. She had not particularly thought about that until now, because there had been no reason to. She spent the time reading and looking out the window and thinking about what she was going toward. She knew what was publicly said about Cadron Ashvale. Every wolf in the territories had heard the broad version: cold and capable, inaccessible but precise. A king who had buried his grief after his mate's death so effectively that the burial had become indistinguishable from his ordinary character. A man who governed 12 distinct and frequently disagreeing packs simultaneously, with an efficiency that no one could dispute, and an emotional presence that no one could locate. She had also heard, from Marin, that he had felt something when he first touched the blade. She thought about that on the third day, looking out at the rolling landscape. She was not nervous, which she recognized as somewhat unusual under the circumstances. She examined the absence of nerves carefully, and found the reason without much difficulty. She had faced the forge table, and what waited there, and she had not flinched from it. A king was simply a person with more authority than most people. She had encountered far more frightening things than authority. The capital city arrived around them gradually, on the fourth morning, its outer districts giving way to central streets that were broader and more purposefully designed, lined with buildings that expected important things to happen near them. The palace rose above everything at the far end, set into a long dark hill, stone and arched windows and columns, enormous in the way that things built to last entire centuries become enormous. The carriage passed through 2 sets of gates and stopped in an inner courtyard. Owen met her. She had not met him before, but she recognized the type immediately. Compact and quiet, with eyes that catalogued everything they touched, and a voice that was kept deliberately unassuming. He told her his name, and that he would escort her to the throne room. She followed him through corridors that were wide and high-ceilinged, lit by long windows that caught the pale winter light and spread it evenly. The floors were gray and black stone, very clean. Guards at intervals straightened slightly when Owen passed without appearing to be aware that they were doing it. She noted the directions she moved and the turns she took, not urgently, simply out of the habit of attention. The throne room doors were tall and dark and open. She walked in. Cadron Ashvale stood at the far end. He was not sitting on the throne. He was standing to the left of it, at the edge of the raised platform, in the posture of a man who uses a throne as a working tool and does not require it for the fact of his authority. He wore dark colors, with no ceremonial additions. He was watching her from the moment she came through the doors, which meant he had been waiting and watching the doors. She walked to the center of the room and stopped at the appropriate distance and gave him the pack bow, technically correct, for an omega presenting to a king, not the full submission form that would have been protocol for a lower-ranked alpha meeting him, and not the standing acknowledgement that would have been an underestimation of his rank. He noticed. She could see it in the fractional shift of his expression, something that lived near but was not quite surprise. "You know court protocol," he said. His voice was exactly what she might have predicted from its reputation, low and even, the voice of a man who had learned that precision mattered more than volume. "Marin taught me," she said. "She thought if I was going to be here I should do it correctly." "Sound advice," he said. He said nothing more for a moment. He was looking at her with the specific, careful attention of someone who reads people quickly, as a matter of professional habit, and was finding that his usual speed was not sufficient for what he was trying to read. She let him look. She stood still and returned his gaze, without challenge and without submission, with no particular expression layered over what she actually felt, which was simply present. He stepped down from the platform. He walked toward her and stopped at a distance that was natural for conversation, and up close he was taller than she had gauged, though the quality of her expression did not adjust for it. "Tell me your name," he said. He knew it already. She understood that completely. It was in the summons, and in whatever intelligence Owen had assembled before her arrival. He asked anyway, and the way he asked made it sound like a question he genuinely needed answered by her, rather than by a document. "Seraphine Voss," she said. He was quiet. Something passed through his expression that he had arranged back to neutrality before most observers would have registered it. She caught it, because she had spent years learning to read the small, genuine signals in people's faces, the ones that appear and disappear before the managed version settles back into place. What she saw was recognition, not the recognition of a person you have met, the recognition of a sound you have been hearing, inside your own head, and have just heard, arrive in the room with you. "Welcome to Ashvale Palace, Seraphine Voss," he said. His voice was even. The rest of him was not, by a very small and very deliberate margin, that she suspected few people in this palace were close enough to him to measure. She looked at him, at the controlled surface and the dark gray eyes, and the careful exact way he was standing, taking up precisely the space required, and not a fraction more. She thought, this is someone who is very tired of being this contained. She did not say it. "Thank you," she said. "Where would you like to begin?" He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen, that had no warmth in it yet. Just a brief structural change at the left corner of his mouth, there and gone, before it fully formed. "Tonight you will rest from the journey," he said. "Tomorrow we begin. Owen will show you to your rooms." He turned and walked back toward the platform. She watched him go. At the door, Owen appeared and gestured silently for her to follow. Behind her, as she left the throne room, she was fairly certain she heard something. A low, very faint sound, from somewhere within the palace, from whatever room the blade was being kept. A hum, just below the range of comfortable hearing, that she felt in her chest before she heard it anywhere else. Or perhaps that was only the echo in the high ceiling. She walked with Owen through the palace corridors toward the east wing, noting the turns and the distances, and she did not look back. She was given rooms in the east wing of the palace, at the end of a corridor with 3 other doors, all belonging to members of the court who kept different hours than she did, and who she would come to know over the following weeks, primarily through the sound of their footsteps. The rooms were not large by palace standards, but they were well furnished, and they had a window that looked out over the inner garden, which at this time of year was bare and perfectly maintained. There was a bed, a writing table, a low bookshelf already stocked with volumes someone had selected in advance, and a chest of drawers. A fire had been laid in the grate, and there was a covered tray of food on the table that turned out to be significantly better than anything she had eaten in the previous month. She sat on the edge of the bed and took stock. She had been in the capital for 3 hours. She had met the Alpha King. She had a room in a palace with good food and a fire and a window. Her back was sore, in the way it was always sore now, present and manageable. She was tired from 4 days of travel. She picked up one of the books from the shelf, opened it, read 6 pages, and fell asleep sitting up. Owen explained her official role the next morning, with the careful delivery of someone who understands that what he is explaining was invented specifically for the present situation, with no historical precedent to reference. The position was Blade Bond Consultant. She would be required to attend formal briefings 3 times per week, and to remain available for consultation regarding the blade's operational characteristics. She would remain in the palace for the duration of the consultancy period. "How long is the consultancy period?" she asked. Owen's expression settled into its neutral state. "That has not been formally specified," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then said, "All right," and that was the end of that conversation. The fang blade was kept in a sealed iron mount, built for it in the inner throne room. When Owen brought her to it for the first formal assessment session, the blade's response was immediate. The silver-violet light along its edge brightened visibly, before she had even crossed the threshold. The hum, which sat at its usual low register throughout the day, shifted upward by a fraction, the way a note shifts when you move an instrument's string. 2 of the guards standing near the mount exchanged a glance. Owen watched without changing his expression. Kadrin stood to one side. He was watching the blade, not her. But she noticed that his posture had shifted fractionally from its default precise stillness, a small release of tension across the line of his shoulders. "It responds to your presence," he said. It was a statement of something he had already observed and confirmed, rather than a question. "Yes," she said. "Marin told me the essence link maintains a residual awareness. Does it communicate with you?" She considered this carefully before answering. "Not in words. It is more like a sense of direction, of proximity, as though something that was extended away from me is now much closer to where it belongs." He looked at her then. She had the impression again, the same as in the throne room, that he was reading something in her face that required more than a passing look. The first formal briefing is tomorrow morning, he said. We will be reviewing the Blade's military applications and the current containment strategy limitations along the northern and eastern borders. I'm not a military advisor, she said. No, he said, but you are connected to the Blade. Your presence at briefings will be relevant, even when you are not contributing directly to the strategy. She thought about this for a moment. What if I have something relevant to contribute? She asked. The corner of his expression shifted. Then say it, he said. She did. The first briefing was the following morning, in a long room, with maps covering 3 of the 4 walls, and a table around which sat Cadron, Owen, General Gareth, who had traveled to the capital in his role as Ironmore's military representative, 2 of the palace's senior generals, and Clara, whom Seraphine had met briefly the previous day, and whose intelligence was visible in everything about her. For the first 40 minutes she said nothing. She listened. She learned the structure of the discussion, who deferred to whom, which points produced genuine engagement, and which were performed for the record. Then General Aldrich, attending in his separate capacity as a council representative, said something about the eastern settlements that she knew to be factually incorrect, based on confirmed information she had received 2 days before leaving Ironmore. The eastern settlements have already been fully evacuated, she said. The room went quiet in the specific way of a room where someone unexpected has spoken. Ironmore received confirmation 2 days before my departure, she said, keeping her voice at the same level it would have been if someone had asked her a direct question. The families relocated to the valley shelters. The settlements themselves are empty. Deploying troops to those locations would be a misallocation of the available force. A pause. She is correct, Gareth said from across the table. He said it the way Gareth said everything, without softening or embellishment. I received the same confirmation. The troop concentration should be along the northern line, Seraphine said. The Wraiths are moving in that direction, because the northern settlements are still occupied. That is where the Blade will be most effective. The room adjusted. Not dramatically, but the map reference points of the subsequent discussion shifted north, and the eastern allocation was quietly dropped. Cadron had not moved during this exchange. He was watching her with the careful attention she was becoming accustomed to, the kind that required patience from its subject. He said, agreed, and moved to the next item. She attended every briefing after that. She learned the maps with the same methodical attention she had given to every learning task Marin had set her over 3 years. She asked questions that turned out to be better than she initially realized they were. The general stopped looking at Cadron before answering her, which she measured as a reasonable marker of progress. She also spent a significant portion of every evening in the palace library. It was on the 2nd floor of the east wing, 2 corridors from her rooms, a long room with floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 sides, and tall windows that caught the afternoon and evening light from the west. She had begun with the military histories, because they were directly relevant to the briefings. She moved on to the older texts about Hollow Wraith movement, and the recorded accounts of the pre-contract campaigns, which turned out to be more useful than she had expected. On the 8th night, she fell asleep at the reading table, with a bound volume open under her cheek. She woke some hours later. The lamp she had lit when she arrived had burned down considerably. The library was empty and dark at the far end, and there was a second lamp burning on the table that she had not lit, recently lit, casting additional light over the section of the book she had been reading. She sat up and looked at the lamp. Someone had also placed a folded note beside the open book. She opened it. In very neat, very controlled handwriting, it said, page 47. The Wraith convergence patterns from the pre-contract campaigns are documented in greater detail there. No name. She turned to page 47. The passage was exactly as described, and significantly more useful than what she had been reading. She held the folded note for a moment, and then set it carefully aside. The following evening she came back to the library and did not fall asleep. She read until quite late. Around the 9th hour, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside that slowed near the library door, paused, then continued on. She looked up from her book. She looked back down at her book. 3 days after that, in a moment between the formal afternoon briefing and a dinner she was expected to attend, she encountered Cadron in the corridor outside the map room. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped. They stood as two people stand when they have arrived at the same point from different directions, which happened in palaces, and yet the ordinary explanation felt very thin. You have been reading about the convergence patterns, he said. The note on page 47 was useful, she said. He said nothing. She said, Why am I still here, Your Majesty? He stood very still. The Blade Bond consultation consists of 3 briefings per week, she said. I have attended 8 briefings and contributed to 6. The essence link is stable. The blade functions within all the expected parameters we established in the first assessment session. Any of this information could have been documented and sent to Ironmore in a written report. My physical presence here is not required for any of it. He looked at her. The corridor was quiet around them. From somewhere behind the nearest wall came the muffled sound of the dinner being set up in the main hall. He did not answer. She waited. He still did not answer. She had spent too many years occupying invisible spaces to be made uncomfortable by silence. She waited him out, and the silence between them stretched and held, and something in the quality of it was unusual. It was not an empty silence. It was the silence of two people who are standing closer to something than either of them has named out loud yet. The blade functions better when you are present, he said finally. He said it as a man says the one part of a larger truth that he has judged appropriate to say out loud. She looked at him for another moment. All right, she said. She walked past him toward the dining room. Behind her, she was aware of him standing in the corridor for a moment before following. Clara, who had been watching their interactions from various careful distances for the better part of 2 weeks, found an extremely absorbing piece of paperwork to occupy herself with that evening, and smiled without stopping for the better part of an hour. The delegation from the Southern Territories arrived on a morning of low cloud, 12 riders and 1 man, in an enclosed carriage, who introduced himself to the outer gate guard as Alpha Lord Drake. He was announced before he was seen by the sound of the arrival, too deliberate, too staged, with the specific energy of someone who has rehearsed the entrance and wants it registered. He was perhaps 40 years old, well dressed in the particular way of men who want their clothing to do political work for them, with a face that wore charm the way a building wears paint, convincingly from a reasonable distance and more obviously constructed up close. Seraphine watched the arrival from the library window and noted her impressions. Drake was brought to the inner hall and presented to Kadrin before noon. The formal introduction was brief. Drake spoke with the smooth competence of someone who has delivered a message multiple times in his head and is giving a polished version. He had traveled to Ashvale Palace, he said, on behalf of a coalition of southern packs, who had serious concerns about the newly completed fang blade and the method by which it had been constructed. He used the word method with a particular weight. Kadrin looked at him without expression and said he would receive a formal presentation in the council chamber in 48 hours. Drake accepted this and withdrew with his attendants. Owen appeared at Kadrin's shoulder, moments after the delegation left the hall. He has been coordinating with 3 of the southwestern Alpha Lords for approximately 2 months, Owen said in the low, matter-of-fact voice he used for intelligence reports. This visit was planned before the blade was even completed. The blade is the vehicle, not the reason. What is the reason? Kadrin said. Territorial concession requests. The border agreements that were finalized 4 years ago, under your authority. Drake's coalition believes that a moment of political complexity creates an opportunity to reopen them. Kadrin was quiet for a moment. Will the hearing require Seraphine to be present? Owen paused very briefly. His formal case targets the binding method directly. He will need to examine the donor. Something moved in Kadrin's face, a small, controlled tightening. Keep me informed of every development, he said. The hearing was convened 2 days later in the council chamber, a room designed specifically for formal proceedings of this nature. The senior generals were present, along with Clara, Owen, court members, and representatives from 6 of the 12 packs, who happened to be in the capital for other scheduled matters, and whose presence had been noted by Drake's people in advance. Seraphine was informed the evening before that she would be called to answer questions. She spent the evening in the library, not reading, just sitting in the chair by the west window, with the lamp turned low, thinking through the shape of the case Drake would make, and what her truthful answers to each of its angles would be. The hearing began with formality. Drake stood at the presentation table and delivered his opening statement with the practiced ease of rehearsal, his voice pitched for the room. The fang blade, he said, had been reforged using a method that bore significant and troubling resemblance to a practice documented in historical texts as covenant binding, a method explicitly prohibited under the Neutral Council Accords of 3 centuries past. Covenant binding drew on a person's physical essence in ways that constituted a form of irreversible magical obligation. The person who completed the process was permanently connected to the weapon. The person who carried the weapon gained a pathway to the donor that was not consented to in any meaningful sense, and could function as a form of coercion. He had scholars who could confirm the historical parallel in precise detail. The scholars spoke. They were thorough and footnoted. Then Drake called Seraphine to the witness position. She walked to the table and sat. His first questions were straightforward. What was her rank in Ironmore Pack? Her role before the ritual? Her training, if any, in forge practice? She answered each one directly. Omega, healer's assistant. None. He shifted his approach on the fourth question. Were you informed, he said, before agreeing to participate in the ritual, that the process would create a permanent link between yourself and any person who subsequently carried the blade? She paused, not from uncertainty, from the understanding that the question required precision. I was told the essence link was permanent, she said. I was not provided with the complete picture of all its possible implications at that point in time. Drake's expression shifted slightly, the way a man's expression shifts when a door opens where he thought there was a wall. So you were not fully informed before consenting. I was told what the healer understood at the time, she said. Additional implications were disclosed to me at a later point. But not before you agreed to proceed. The information available to me when I agreed was sufficient for me to make the decision I made, she said. Drake clasped his hands together on the table. Is it not the case that had you known, prior to the ritual, that an unmated person of alpha standing would carry the blade and potentially develop a connection to you through the essence link, you might have chosen differently? The chamber was very quiet. Seraphine looked at Drake. She thought about the children who had been playing by the eastern fence at Ironmore on the evening she made her decision. She thought about the 4 settlements that were ash. She thought about Ivy, who was 3 years old and did not yet have a complete word for the absence in her life. She thought about 8 packs running out of time on their containment strategies. No, she said. I would have made the same decision. Drake's eyebrows moved. You are certain of that? I gave my answer once, she said. I generally don't repeat myself. A sound somewhere in the chamber, very quiet. She did not identify the source. Drake moved to his next approach. He questioned Marin's qualifications. He questioned the council's role in the decision. He built, carefully and without stating it directly, the suggestion that Seraphine had not been freely volunteering, but had been maneuvered into a position where refusal was effectively impossible for someone of her low standing. She answered every question, clearly, directly, without visible agitation and without performed calm, because she was genuinely calm, because the questions were designed to shake something loose from what she knew about her own decision, and what she knew about her own decision was solid enough that there was nothing for the technique to grip. By the time Drake sat down, he had covered every prepared angle, and she had not provided a single answer he could build damage from. Kadrin sat at the head of the chamber throughout the entire proceeding, and did not move. He watched Seraphine with the kind of attention that he had not attempted to conceal, and the court had noticed this, and most of them had been too absorbed in the content of the hearing itself to do more than file it away. After the chamber was dismissed and the gathering dispersed, Seraphine walked out into the corridor and stood in the quieter air and breathed. She was fine. She knew she was fine. She had not shaken or fumbled or given Drake what he needed. She felt exactly as she had before walking in. Footsteps approached from behind. She recognized the pace without turning. Kadrin came to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside her, at an angle that made the positioning feel like a choice rather than a default. He did not speak immediately. She let the silence be whatever it was going to be. You didn't need to be that steady, he said eventually. Most people would have let some portion of it show. How would that have helped anything? She said. He turned his head slightly to look at her profile. She was looking at the wall across from them. It wouldn't have, he said. Another pause. You are the most courageous person in this court, he said. He said it quietly, and without any of the formal distance he used as his default register. He said it as a fact he had been holding during the entire proceeding, and had found, unexpectedly, that he did not want to continue to hold alone. She turned to look at him. He was standing close enough that she could see the things his expression was not entirely hiding, the exhaustion underneath the precision. The grief that had been in place long enough that he had stopped trying to shift it, and had instead simply built his life in the space that remained around it. He had fitted himself into the shape that was left after losing something, and he had made it work, and the cost of making it work was present in every line of his face, if you knew how to look. He was watching her with dark gray eyes that carried something she recognized, because she had carried its equivalent herself for years. The particular quality of loneliness that belongs to someone who has been necessary for so long that they have stopped expecting to be known. She reached up and placed her hand over his. His hand was resting against the wall beside him. She placed her palm flat over the back of it, her hand much smaller than his, and the gesture asked for nothing, and offered nothing, except the simple fact of contact. He did not pull away. They stood in the corridor in the quiet, while the palace settled around them, people moving through the far rooms, the small ordinary sounds of an evening beginning. "I'm sorry," he said, low, almost to himself. "For what?" she asked. "For whatever happened to you before anyone thought to tell you the full cost of what you were choosing," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "It was my choice," she said. "I made it knowing what I knew." "I know," he said. "That doesn't change that you should have been told everything." She thought about this. "No," she said, "it doesn't." She lifted her hand from his. The corridor was quiet. "Drake's case will not hold," he said. His voice had returned to its usual register. The historical precedents his scholars cited do not apply under current interpretive standards. Clara confirmed it last night. "I know," she said. "Clara told me before the hearing." He looked at her. "Clara told you?" "She thought I should be prepared. She is very practical." Something changed in his expression that she suspected counted as warmth by his particular scale of things. "Yes," he said. "She is." He started to turn away. He stopped. "The library," he said. He did not turn back toward her. She waited. "The note on page 47, he said. It was not Owen. She had known this, from the evening she found the lamp burning. She had known it from the particular quality of the gesture, the care of it. Not efficient, deliberate in a different way. "I know," she said. He walked away down the corridor. She stood and looked at the space where his hand had been against the wall. Marin arrived at Ashvale Palace on a cold morning, 11 days after the hearing, unannounced and carrying a small travel bag, and the expression of a woman who has been calculating the right moment to have a difficult conversation, and has concluded that no version of the moment will be better than the present one. She asked for Seraphine first. Owen brought her to the library, where Seraphine was working through a bound collection of old forge records that Owen had located from the palace archive at her request. Marin sat down across the table from her without preliminary. "I need to tell you what I should have told you before the ritual," she said. Seraphine closed the record book. "All right." Marin was quiet for only a moment, the specific quiet of someone gathering the starting point of something they have been composing for a while. "The essence link," she said, "in documented cases where the blade passes to an unmated carrier, does not remain in its latent state. It develops. The donor's energy, carried in the blade, creates a pathway. The carrier begins to feel the donor through the metal, and the donor, over time, begins to feel the carrier in return, from whatever distance separates them." "You told me this might happen," Seraphine said. "The morning after the ritual, you told me about this possibility." "I told you some of it," Marin said. "I did not tell you what happens when the pathway develops past a certain point." Seraphine waited. Marin folded her hands on the table. "When both the donor and the carrier have acknowledged the pathway, and when each of them chooses to complete rather than sever the connection, the link transforms into something that the oldest texts describe as a soul bond. It is not a standard mate bond. It is older than that. It requires an active, fully informed choice from both people, and once made, it is permanent in a way that a standard bond is not." Seraphine was very still. "If the choice is not made," Marin continued, "or if either person chooses to sever the connection, rather than complete it, the link dissolves. The binding energy in the blade is released. The blade reverts to its pre-forging state. It does not necessarily shatter again, but the power leaves it. The capacity to hold back the hollow wraiths goes with it. Seraphine looked at the closed record book on the table in front of her. And if both people choose to complete the bond, she said, the donor's energy is permanently woven into the carrier's, his into hers. The soul bond cannot be broken without causing significant harm to both people. Seraphine sat with this. Outside the library window, the inner garden moved faintly in a winter wind, bare branches touching each other. How developed is the pathway currently? She asked. Very, Marin said. I could feel the blade pulling when I passed near the throne room this morning, and I am not the donor. She held Seraphine's eyes. The connection has been building since the carriage left Ironmore. It accelerated when you arrived in the palace, and have been in physical proximity to the blade regularly. Seraphine looked at the table for a moment. When were you going to tell me this? She asked. She asked it the way she asked most things, without particular accusation. She genuinely wanted to know the calculation. I should have told you before the ritual, Marin said. At that point, the full scope was uncertain, and I didn't want to add a weight that might influence your decision for the wrong reasons. Then the ritual proceeded, and the link developed faster than my most significant projection, and I kept waiting for a better moment to disclose what I knew. She paused. There is not a better moment. I waited too long. Seraphine nodded. He needs to be told, she said. All of it, clearly. The choice has to be made with complete information on both sides. Yes, Marin said. I agree. I'll ask Owen to arrange a meeting. The meeting took place that afternoon, in Kadrin's private study. The room looked exactly like the room of a man who spent nearly all of his waking hours working, every surface in use, maps and documents and several books open simultaneously, with one chair near the window that had the quality of something used at the end of every day. Kadrin sat at his desk. Marin sat across from him. Seraphine stood to one side, not because she intended it as a statement, but because that was where she had come to stand while the room was settling. Marin explained everything. She used the same plain, level tone she had used in the forge room months ago when she told Seraphine what the ritual involved. She did not soften anything, and she did not elaborate beyond what was accurate. Kadrin listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise. What was the expected timeline before the soul bond's development required a decision? Whether the blade would degrade gradually or suddenly if the bond were severed. Whether Seraphine had been fully informed of what was developing. Marin answered the first 2 and said that the third had been partially addressed. A pause. Partially, Kadrin said. Yes, Marin said. He was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from his usual controlled quiet. The precision was still there, but underneath it, something had changed. A tightening that was not professional in nature. Seraphine was brought through a significant physical process, he said, with consequences she was not told about. She was not told that the essence link would develop into a pathway. She was not told that the resolution of that pathway would require a choice that places the blade's power as a consequence. She was not told that she would have no practical ability to exit the connection without that consequence falling. He set down the pen he had been holding. That is not an information gap. That is a substantial failure to disclose. Yes, Marin said. It is. Kadrin looked at Seraphine for a moment. She held his eyes. It will be addressed, he said. He said it as a statement of what he intended to do, not a question or a comfort. After Marin left, Seraphine went back to her rooms. She sat on the edge of the bed and thought. She thought about the choice and what it meant. Permanent. She examined that word from every angle and found, with some interest, that it did not frighten her. She had spent most of her life in arrangements that held no permanence at all, useful until not needed and then set aside, and she had accommodated that without much difficulty. The idea of something that could not be set aside was not frightening. It was, if she was being honest with herself, the thing she had never thought she would be the kind of person who was offered. She thought about Kadrin, the lamp in the library, the note on page 47, his hand under hers in the corridor, and the absolute stillness with which he had accepted that contact. The way he had said she was the most courageous person in his court, without any professional distance around it. A man who had felt something in a blade and asked, before any other question, to find the person who had made it. She already knew what she would choose. She suspected she had known it in the corridor the night of the hearing. She was still sitting on the bed, thinking this through, when a knock came at her door. She opened it. One of Drake's riders stood in the corridor, a large man she did not recognize, with two more behind him. Their posture was the specific posture of people who have come to do something they have been told is simple, and are ready for it to be less simple. "Lord Drake requires your presence," the man said. She looked at the three of them. She assessed the situation and the time it takes to assess it when you have learned to think fast. Calling for help would bring guards. Guards would be hurt, because these three men were ready for that. Running in the corridor would end the same way. "I see," she said. "Let me get my coat." She turned back into the room. She did not go for her coat. She went to the window, which she opened just far enough to make the open position obvious, and left her small personal journal on the sill, placed so that it would not fall, but would be clearly visible to anyone doing the morning room check. An open window on a cold night in a room on an upper floor was unusual enough that it would be reported. Then she put on her coat and turned around and walked out with Drake's men, because walking out with them was the choice that kept guards from being hurt in a palace corridor over something that could be addressed another way. The corridor was empty. They moved quickly and quietly through the east wing, down a servant's stair, through the outer passage, and out through the northeast service gate. As they moved, she observed three things, with the automatic precision of someone who has learned to pay attention to more than the most obvious thing in any moment: the route, the gate, and the direction of travel. She memorized all three. In the morning, a palace attendant, doing the early room check, found the open window and the journal on the sill and reported it to Owen before the bell had finished ringing. Owen went directly to Kadrin. Kadrin stood in the corridor outside Seraphine's rooms for 3 seconds, which was 2.5 seconds longer than he stood still for anything in his ordinary day. Then he moved. He did not call his generals. He did not convene a council, or send a formal diplomatic message, or activate the official channels through which the Alpha King of 12 territories could deploy considerable force. He did this for 2 reasons, and both of them, had his court known them, would have significantly alarmed several people who had been carefully managing their assessments of him for the last 7 years. The first reason was practical. A visible force deployment could be seen coming from a distance, and Drake would have time to move Seraphine before it arrived. The kind of time Drake could be given with Seraphine was not time that could be allowed. The second reason was not practical. The second reason was that Kadrin Ashvale, who had governed 12 wolf packs for 7 years, with the cold precision of a man who had removed personal feeling from his decision-making as a deliberate and permanent policy, could not make himself go through the official channels, could not make himself stand still long enough for them. He took Owen. He took 2 guards named Finn and Cole who had been with him for 6 years, and who, when he appeared in Finn's quarters before dawn in full travel gear, simply stood up and began putting on their boots. No questions. They had learned the kind of trust that does not require explanation. He also took the fang blade. He had not planned to take the blade. His intention had been to leave it in the palace under appropriate guard, because it was the most significant military asset in the 12 territories, and traveling with it was not strategically necessary. But he passed through the inner throne room, on his way to the outer courtyard, and he picked up the blade without stopping, and he did not put it back down. Owen caught up with him in the outer courtyard. "The route?" Owen said, in the tone of a man confirming operational details rather than asking for permission. "She left the window open, and the journal on the sill," Kadrin said, moving toward the horses. She understood someone would check the room in the morning. "The northeast service gate is the one Drake's people used. That route leads through the valley past toward his southern estate. You know Drake's routes." "I know all the significant routes through the 12 territories," Kadrin said. "Get your horse." They rode out before first light, the city still dark around them as they moved through its outer districts and into the open road south. The fang blade at his back was not passive weight. He had known this from the moment he first touched it. It had a quality of direction, a responsiveness to intent, the way a compass responds to north, settling when his course was accurate, and shifting very slightly when it was not. In the weeks since he had learned about the soul bond, he had come to understand this differently. The blade did not respond to general direction. It responded to Seraphine. Her essence in the metal was the compass, and the compass was pointing southeast, toward Drake's southern estate, with a certainty that was different from any other characteristic the blade had shown him. He rode toward it. They crossed the valley before midday, moving on roads that were empty at this hour except for supply wagons and travelers who moved out of the way of 4 riders going at speed. Owen rode beside him and said nothing, which was one of the significant professional qualities that made Owen valuable. The blade's pull was clear and unbroken, not urgency, not distress, a steady, certain direction. The way a river's current feels if you put your hand into it, not violent, just present and unmistakable. She was ahead. She was there. She was all right. He knew the last of these with a certainty that was not strictly rational, and he did not spend any energy questioning it. They stopped at the valley floor to water the horses, and Owen came to stand beside him while he looked southeast at the ridge that marked the beginning of Drake's territorial holdings. Drake will expect the formal channels, Owen said. A message, a council. Negotiations with his demands as the framework. I know, Cadron said. He will not expect you to come yourself. No, Cadron said. He won't. They moved through the valley pass in the late afternoon and came out on the other side into the lower country, where Drake's estate sat at the base of a long slope, walled and lit, and expecting nothing that was currently coming toward it. Seraphine had been awake since before Drake's men brought her out of the palace. The holding room she had been given at Drake's outer estate was a stone room with one narrow window and a solid lock on the outside. It was warm enough, and she had been given food at regular intervals, because Drake understood that an unhurt and functional Seraphine was more useful to his purpose than an unhurt but undermined one. He wanted leverage, not a complication. She used the time the way she used most time that was available to her, to think. Drake's plan was straightforward. He would send a formal message to Cadron, presenting his demands, and offering her return as the resolution condition. He would allow reasonable time for the official channels to operate. He expected days, possibly a week. She expected fewer than that. She knew this not from strategy, but from something more immediate. The hum in her chest, which had been present since she arrived at the palace, and which had become simply a background fact of her daily experience. The way you eventually stop consciously hearing a river when you live beside one, was louder than usual, and it was getting louder in a way that was directional, not above her or around her, coming toward her. She sat on the low bench in the holding room and thought about the guards. 2 on rotation, 1 at her door, 1 at the outer gate. They changed every 6 hours. At approximately the 4th hour of each rotation, the door guard walked to the end of the east corridor to speak with the gate guard, a matter of boredom more than procedure. This left the door unattended for somewhere between 60 and 90 seconds. She was not planning a full escape. She did not know the grounds well enough to navigate them reliably in the dark. What she was planning was more limited. Move from the holding room to the east corridor at the 4th hour. Get a better understanding of the ground level layout. Be somewhere useful when the thing she could feel approaching reached the perimeter. She counted the hours with the patience she had developed for all counting of hours over the last several years. At the 4th hour of the 2nd rotation, she moved. She was in the east corridor, flat against the wall 20 feet from the holding room door, when she heard the first sound from the outer gate. Not a battle, an exchange of voices that was cut short, and then the sound of things being handled with the minimum necessary force and the maximum necessary certainty. She moved toward the east stairs. The outer gate opened from within. She heard the mechanism of it from her position, because she had moved close enough. She heard footsteps come through it, and she recognized one set of footsteps from 3 months of palace corridors, and that one recognition was enough. She pressed herself into the doorway of the first room off the east stairs, and let Drake's guards, who came running down the corridor, go past her. She was very practiced at occupying spaces people do not think to look into. Then she moved back the way the guards had come, toward the sound of the situation being settled. She found him in the outer yard. He was standing at the center of it with the fang blade in his hand. The blade's edge was lit with silver-violet light that was entirely its own, and not the torches, throwing color across the stone of the yard. 3 of Drake's outer guards were on the ground, conscious but not interested in continuing. Owen stood at the east wall, Cole at the north, Finn at the gate through which they had entered. Cadron turned the moment she came through the eastern door. The controlled surface he usually maintained had shifted. Not broken. Shifted. The usual management of everything beneath it had loosened along certain specific seams, and what was present underneath those seams was looking at her now, without any of the professional distance between it and the surface. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. He exhaled once, slowly. "We need to move," Owen said from the east wall. He said it with the complete neutrality of a man who is very deliberately not commenting on anything he has observed in the last 30 seconds. "Yes," Kadrin said. They moved through the gate and southeast into open country, away from Drake's estate and the sound of it, moving for approximately an hour until the land flattened and the traces of what had been, before a fire 2 seasons past, a small village came into view. The burned-out shell of the largest building still had its 4 walls standing, roofless but solid, sheltered enough from the wind to be useful. They stopped there. Finn checked the perimeter. Cole built a fire in what had been the central room, using the scattered roof wood that still lay in the interior. Owen positioned himself at the outer opening. Kadrin and Seraphine stood inside the 4 walls under the open sky. Through the broken upper edges of the stonework, the first pale gray of dawn was beginning at the eastern horizon. She was looking up at the sky. She heard him move. She turned. He was on one knee in front of her. She had understood kneeling as ceremony, as a formal position with specific protocol meaning. This was not ceremony. This was a man who had gone to the floor because the alternative, the full height from which he ordinarily addressed the world, was somehow dishonest, given what he was trying to say. He had made himself lower because staying at his usual position would have been a lie about what he felt. "I have governed 12 territories for 7 years, he said. His voice was even and quiet. The control in it was not his usual management of feeling. It was the effort required to say something he had no practice saying, clearly and without error. "I have been functional. I have been useful. I have done what was required of me without exception." He paused. He looked at her hands, and then at her face. "I have not been anything else for a very long time." She watched him, and said nothing. "When I touched the blade the first time," he said, "I felt something that I had spent 7 years working to make sure I would never feel again. Because the only thing more difficult than losing something is realizing, after the loss, that you were not finished needing it." She let him speak. "I am not asking you because the bond creates a question that needs answering," he said. "I am asking you in spite of the fact that the bond makes it impossible to ask cleanly, because no matter how I phrase it, the consequences involved make it sound like there is only one acceptable answer. I am asking you to set aside the consequences." The dawn above the open roof had deepened toward the first real color of morning. She looked at him on one knee, with his face open, in the way it was not open in any hall or any formal room, the management set aside, and what was underneath it present and visible, and waiting for whatever she would say. She reached out and cupped his face in both hands. He went very still. She said, "I gave you my spine once already. You've been walking straighter ever since." He closed his eyes. The warmth between them shifted, the way the temperature of a room shifts when the fire has finally caught fully. Not sudden, but total. Not a change. A completion of something that had been arriving slowly for months. The dawn widened above the open roof of the burned-out house. Finn, at the perimeter, looked at the sky and did not look toward the interior of the building. Owen, at the gate, stood perfectly still and was professionally unaware of everything. She chose. She made this clear to Marin, who had ridden south to meet them on the road back to the capital, with the practical expression of someone who had been fairly certain about the outcome, but had come in person, because some things require a person's physical presence rather than a message. Seraphine told her in the carriage, directly, while Marin sat across from her with a cup of strong herb tea in both hands. The choice was hers. She was making it for reasons she was willing to state clearly, and did not need confirmed or interpreted by anyone else. She was not making it because the soul bond created a convenient resolution. She was not making it because the blade needed her to complete the connection to remain powerful. She was not making it because a man had knelt before dawn in the ruins of a burned house, and said things that would have been very difficult to walk away from, although she noted that those things had been true, and she had heard them as true, and that was its own significant fact. She was making it because she had spent 3 months in daily proximity to a person who reminded her, consistently and without intending to, that steadiness could be chosen by people who were fully capable of choosing differently, and that the kind of man who lights a lamp carefully in a library, so as not to wake a sleeping person, and leaves a note about a useful page, is the kind of man she had always understood to exist in the world without having any direct evidence. Maren listened to all of this. "Good," she said, and handed her the tea. The soul bond completed quietly over the following days, which was fitting, given the temperaments of both people involved. There was no ceremony to mark its completion, and no single moment that could be identified afterward as the exact point. It happened the way a wound heals when given the right conditions, gradually and in the background of everything else, until one morning Seraphine became aware that the hum in her chest was no longer something she was conscious of as a separate signal. It had become simply part of the way she existed, constant and unremarkable and entirely necessary. Kadrin noticed the same change on the same morning. He stood at his study window for approximately 3 minutes, which for him was an exceptional pause, and then went to his morning briefing. Drake's case fell apart cleanly within 48 hours of the return to the capital. Owen, in the time between Kadrin's departure from the palace and their return, had assembled a thorough account of Drake's 2 months of advance coordination with the Southwestern Coalition. The evidence made clear that the concerns about the blade's construction were manufactured as a vehicle for the actual objective, which was leverage for reopening the border agreements. Owen presented this to the neutral council representatives who had remained at the palace following the original hearing. The neutral council deliberated for 4 hours. Their ruling was complete and comprehensive. The fang blade had been forged in accordance with lawful practice in every material respect. The donor's consent was established beyond any reasonable question, as her testimony had demonstrated. The information failure in the disclosure process had been acknowledged directly by the King's Court and had been addressed through the creation of a comprehensive documentation standard for any future forge practitioners. Drake was stripped of his Alpha Lord designation by unanimous decision of the 12-pack representatives present. He was exiled to the outer territories with no political standing and no right to return for 30 years. He did not contest the decision. He had miscalculated the size of what he had applied pressure to, and it had turned out to be significantly larger than his projection. The morning after Drake's exile was formally recorded, Seraphine attended the military briefing, as she attended every briefing, and she sat at the table to Kadrin's right, which was where she had been sitting since the morning of their return, when she had taken the seat, and he had opened the briefing without comment on it, which she had read as the answer that it was. The briefing was about the Northern Front and the timeline for deployment. The Hollow Wraiths had continued their movement through the outer territories during the weeks of political disruption, slower than the worst projections, as though the presence of the completed blade in the territories had introduced some resistance into their advance. But the front was there, and the 8 packs who had reported a single lunar cycle of containment capacity were now well inside that limit. The deployment plan Kadrin constructed was not conceived as a battle in the way that formal military campaigns are conceived. It was a precision operation. A single advance to the specific point on the northern territorial boundary, where the Wraith convergence was densest, where the damage to the surrounding land was most severe, and the accumulated pressure on the front packs was greatest, and where the blade's power, if the old campaign records were accurate in their description of its effects, would be most decisive. He planned it with the thoroughness he brought to every significant decision, exhaustive preparation, with no concession to the possibility of failure, because identifying and addressing variables was more useful than preparing for a failure that careful planning could prevent. Seraphine reviewed every version of the plan, not because he requested it, although he came too, but because she had spent 3 months learning everything available about Hollow Wraith movement, and the pre-contract era campaigns, and the blade's documented characteristics, and the plans improved each time she went through them. She found 2 significant errors before the final version was settled. He corrected both without comment, which she had come to understand as his particular form of gratitude, clean and direct and expressed through the act of taking what she offered seriously. The force went out on a morning of clear, cold air, 14 days after Drake's exile was finalized. Seraphine stayed in the capital. She had not been asked to accompany the deployment, and she had not offered. The soul bond's completion meant that her physical proximity to the blade was no longer required for the connection to carry her strength into it. The bond was internal now. What she had given was fully and permanently present in the metal. She stayed and worked. She spent portions of the morning at the high library window, looking northwest in the direction of the deployment, and she felt the blade at its distance, the way she had once felt its hum from across a room. Present. undiminished by the miles. She went back to the briefing records she was reviewing, and kept working. She knew when it happened. It was late afternoon, the light through the library windows at the long flat angle of early winter. She did not see anything. No message had arrived. She simply felt, through the bond, the blade's full use of what it carried, the complete depth of the binding she had given, drawn into active service for the first time since the completion. It was not painful. It was the exact opposite of painful. It was the feeling of something given for a specific purpose, finally reaching that purpose, clean and total and complete, in a way that she did not have adequate language for, but that she recognized. The satisfaction of something done properly. The satisfaction she had felt in the forge room, when she looked at the completed blade in the lamplight, and felt the hum of it, and understood that what had been broken was now whole, and would hold. She sat at the library table for a full minute, and let the feeling be what it was. Then she found Owen, and told him to begin preparing the communications to the other 11 packs, because someone needed to start, and she was available. The force came back to the capital 3 days later. The northern front was closed. The hollow wraiths had been driven back to the dark outer regions they had been advancing from for 2 years. The territories they had moved through would require significant recovery time, the land and its resources damaged in ways that would take more than 1 season to repair, but the advance had an end point now. The front held. The city's response to Kadrin's return was audible from the high courtyard of the palace where Seraphine stood, a sound that built from the outer districts and grew as the force moved through the gates, the kind of sound a large number of people make when something that has been feared for a very long time is suddenly and definitively no longer feared. He came through the palace gates, and she was at the top of the steps. He walked across the courtyard with the fang blade at his side. Darker now, the glow absorbed rather than expressed, a blade that had given everything it carried, and was resting in the way a person rests after something significant has been completed. He stopped in front of her. He was tired from the road in a way that was visible. 3 days of hard travel, and the weight of what had just been done. She looked at him. "It held," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "Of course it held," she said. The corner of his expression shifted. It was still not quite a smile in any conventional sense, but it was closer to one than anything she had seen from him in any public space. She turned and walked back into the palace, and he followed. There was no court-wide announcement, and no political invitations. Seraphine had been asked about her preferences, and had said, without extensive deliberation, that small and quiet was correct. Kadrin had said that was exactly what it would be, and it was. The ceremony was attended by Owen, who stood at precise attention, and fixed his eyes on a point on the far wall for the duration, which was his particular way of being moved without demonstrating it, by Finn and Cole, who had been present from before dawn in a burned-out house, and who therefore had some proprietary feeling about the outcome, by Clara, who had arranged everything in the chapel, including the winter flowers from the palace greenhouse, and the candles on the window ledges, and the small dinner that followed, and who cried openly and completely throughout the ceremony, without any appearance of self-consciousness. By Marin, who had traveled from Ironmoor, and who sat in the first row and wept from the moment the first candle was lit, until well after the last one was extinguished, and who, when asked afterward whether she had been crying, said with complete composure that she had something in her eye. Both eyes, she clarified, for an extended period. Seraphine wore dark blue. She had been asked about the color, and had said whatever was appropriate would be fine, and someone had chosen dark blue, and when she looked at herself in the mirror in her rooms before the ceremony, she thought it was right, which was more consideration than she had given to clothing for most of her life. Kadrin, when she came through the chapel door, went very still. He stayed very still through most of the ceremony. She thought that was appropriate. After the dinner, when everyone had moved through the evening and the palace had settled into its night sounds, she sat with him at the study window, in the chair that belonged to the end of his day, and he sat on the edge of the desk, and they talked. Not about the ceremony, about the recovery plans for the northern territories and the administrative process for dismantling Drake's coalition's border position, and whether the neutral council ruling had created a precedent that would simplify future forge practice disclosures. At some point they stopped talking about any of that and simply sat in the quiet of the room together, the fire burning low, neither of them moving to add more wood, both of them content to let the warmth diminish slowly, rather than interrupt what the room had become. A week later, a letter left the palace, addressed to the Administrative Council of Ironmore Pack. It carried no sender name, and no official designation. It contained a formal instruction for an ongoing monthly fund transfer from a capital account to Ironmore's Healer Forge, sufficient to cover materials, equipment, and staffing for the next 20 years. The seal pressed into the wax at the closing was silver-violet in color and shaped, precisely and deliberately, like a spine. Aldrich received it personally in the council hall. He sat down when he saw the seal. He sat for quite a long time without moving. Down in the forge room below the hall, the space where the fang blade had been assembled was empty. The iron supports that had braced the 7 fragments upright during the reforging were still standing in their positions, lightly dusted with traces from that night. The lamps had not been lit in 2 months. Maren lit one when she returned from the capital. She stood in the forge room with a single lamp and looked at the empty preparation table and thought about the things that had moved outward from this room over the last several months. The way the effects of a small initial decision can travel far beyond what the person making the decision could see from where they were standing at the time. She thought about a girl who had walked through this door without knocking and sat down and listened, and then said, without hesitation and without any performance of it, that she would do it. She thought about all the things that choice had moved: the blade, the battle that had been waiting for the blade, a king who had needed, more than he knew how to say, to be reminded that warmth existed. She thought about the fact that the girl had done it simply because the need was there, and she was there, and that combination seemed, to her, sufficient. Maren blew out the lamp. She walked back up through the corridor and out into the Ironmore evening. The moon was rising, not red, the ordinary winter moon, full and silver and very bright against a clear sky, the kind of moon that makes the world look clean and specific and worth paying careful attention to. She stood and looked at it. She had placed a needle in a spine 7 times in the dark under a blood moon, and the essence that had moved through those needles had traveled farther than she had known to estimate. It had bound a blade. The blade had held a front. A king had carried it, and felt what was in it, and understood that he was not as alone as he had made himself. Far to the east, in a palace room, with a fire burning low, and 2 people sitting in the comfortable quiet of people who have settled something permanent between them. A man who had spent 7 years learning to live in the space grief leaves behind, sat at the edge of a desk and looked at the woman in the chair by the window, and felt the soul bond steady and constant in his chest, like a sound that had been present long enough to become simply the sound of his life. And Seraphine, in the chair, looked out at the winter night and breathed and felt the same thing from her side of it, the steady presence of him through the bond, unremarkable now and entirely necessary. She had given the pack her marrow, her silence, and her pain, believing herself worth nothing more than what she could offer. But the king had worn her courage against his ribs every day since, and he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure she finally felt how much she weighed.